the final brain bug is the persistent message of shame.
Yeah. So I've experienced this personally, where, I'm 8 years into recovery, and I wouldn't call myself a seasoned veteran, but like that's, I've been in it for a while. But man, there are days, moments, choices that I make where I'm like, I should be so much further than this. Why am I making this stupid decision? Like, Instagram Reels. I know that those are a problem. Why am I on them again? Just mindless, like this is a landmine, and I'm just mindlessly wandering through it. I think about those things, and those are the times that shame pops up again for me, at least more like, the most prevalent is when I'm like not communicating clearly to my wife, or I'm blowing up at my kids, or I'm making stupid decisions and not, paying attention to my guardrails. And that message of like, you've been in here for 8 years and you still haven't figured it out. You should be better than this. That's one for sure. That message of shame always seems to creep in. And then another one that I've had to deal with throughout my journey is like, if you were sexually healthy and you didn't have this addiction, your wife would want to have sex with you all the time. And I don't know if you've been in marriage before or you've met, regular people, but I'm not going to say, okay, I'm not going to get into that. But basically, it's not that way. Like, you know what I mean? I remember a friend of mine once, I had lost a bunch of weight, and he was like, oh, I bet your wife can't keep her hands off you. And I was like, oh, she can. Yeah, she totally can. And it wasn't, and that's like, for me at that moment, I remember feeling a lot of shame because it felt like a character statement toward me, or like that I'm not desired or wanted. And I think that when we take, especially in the realm of our sexuality, and we like project that onto our value, or how much we're loved, or how much we're cared for by our spouse, I think we get into really messy situations if my wife has had some significant surgeries and stuff that are impacting her body. And I would say that's a big reason why, if we're not having sex, it usually has something to do with her body and what's going on, the season of life we're in. But it's easy for me, for that voice of shame to come back up. It's like, oh, it's because you don't look like you used to, or you should be further along. And if you were further along, then she would want to have sex with you more. And so it's like and this is just the way that the enemy works. Every opening, it feels like shame can just pop in. And if we're not aware that that's going to happen, and aware of the most consistent messages we tend to get in that, then I don't think we'll take any steps forward in combating the shame.
Yeah, it's to remember that shame is a double-edged sword, because shame can be what keeps someone locked in their addictive pattern or acting out because they feel so bad about what they're doing and they feel worthless. And if people knew I was doing this, they'd reject me. So I'm locked in shame, which actually perpetuates me continuing to do the very things I feel shameful about. But on the other hand, shame can be what drives us into those behaviors as a way to medicate what we're feeling. And it might not be shame that has anything to do with sexual sin or acting out. It may be shame, like you're saying, Trevor, because many of us are kind of perfectionists, or we're performance oriented, that we find our worth and value in how well we perform, or we have expectations of what we should be like as a parent, a spouse, a worker, whatever roles we have in this world. And if we don't live up to our own standard, then that voice of shame says, well, what's wrong with you? Why don't you have it all together? And then that little, blinking red light in the back of our brain starts to go off and say, you know what makes you feel better when you feel this way? Do you know what we used to do? Because the shame messages sometimes are the same. So our brain is associated like, oh, when I hear this message, there's this old place that I ran to. And I think that catches some people off guard, that they're like, well, I totally was not feeling sexual or tempted at all. And I had this day at work and this thing went on. And as I drove home, I drove by that store where I knew I used to buy magazines, and like the trigger just came on like a wave. And what was going on? I thought I was over that. It's like, well, maybe it wasn't a sexual temptation. It was that little voice of shame saying, we know how to make this better. We know a little way to run away from it, and we can get caught back up in medicating shame for all the same reasons as before, even if maybe the entry point was different. So just to be aware of that double-edged sword of shame, that just because you've dealt with the sexual shame doesn't mean you've completely learned to respond appropriately to shame messages that can come from other areas.
Yeah, and I as you were talking about that, there's literally not a day that goes by, and I've said this before in podcasts, that I don't think about what I did and then what happened to me, and then the enemy uses everything that I did and constantly reminder. He's just constantly like throwing. It's like fishing, like fly fishing. He's just constantly throwing that fly out trying to get me to bite on it. And then I realize what's happening. I'm like, okay, I see what you're doing. And then I turn to, well, like we talked about, like, you know, the relapse, you know, are coming out of nowhere. Well, when we see it, it's like, no, I see what you're doing. So I'm going to lean on these tools. So I'm not going to focus on that fly. I'm just going to let it go. Well, it's very difficult.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it comes up several places in the new workbook that I really appreciated, where we do maybe have those curses or things we've believed about ourselves, that I will never be worthy of, or I have permanently disqualified myself from, or because of my past, I will never get to. And they're kind of these now and forever statements that maybe a part of us believes. Well, that also is shame. And if we're finding that on a daily basis, something is coming, say, well, you'll never get to have the marriage you wanted. It's like, well, I don't know what kind of marriage I'll get to have, but I'm not going to listen to a voice of shame that condemns me forever because of my past. So it's just calling those out, and I think taking them to people that love us and can help us work through them, pray over them, speak against them, you know, invite God's truth into them, because those can be very, very deadly. And like I said, I think in the workbook, Ted and the other authors address that in a couple of places.
Yeah.